In the United Nations today, the General Assembly heard a fiery speech from Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli Prime Minister was booed by some delegations as he made his way to the podium. Some others walked out instead of listening to the speech. But of course, his words carry much weight at this time as Israel is fighting on two fronts, one to its north with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the other to its south with Hamas in Gaza, and with both operations a heavy civilian toll.
And Israel has been tolerating this intolerable situation for nearly a year. Well, I've come here today to say enough is enough. As long as Hezbollah chooses the path of war, Israel has no choice, and Israel has every right to remove this threat and return our citizens to their homes safely. And that's exactly what we're doing. And I have another message for this assembly and for the world outside this hall. We are winning.
Well, for some analysis on what we heard today from Benjamin Netanyahu, we're now joined by Christian Leuprecht, security expert, a professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University. He joins us right now in Kingston. Christian, always good to see you. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Hello, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin with Netanyahu's apparent resolve here to continue offensive against Hezbollah positions in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. What does that mean for all these calls from countries like Canada that have been demanding for a ceasefire?
Well, so for better or for worse, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And however imperfect Israeli democracy may be, it is a democracy and it has a legitimate government. And many Israelis disagree with that government. Many people internationally might disagree with that government. But ultimately, this is Israel making its own sovereign decisions. And we can't say to countries like Ukraine, we're going to back you and we're going to provide you weapons and financial support so that you can make your own sovereign decisions in terms of defending yourself against Russia. But then with Israel, we say, well, so hang on, we're going to interfere in your sovereignty and we're going to tell you how to do things. So we can only have it one way or the other way. And so I think this Janus-faced hypocritical discourse by the West and by Canada is profoundly unhelpful because it looks like it's electoral politicking by countries playing to their electorates rather than their strategic interests. Our strategic interests in Canada are ultimately about regional stability. In 1956, we were a key player in bringing stability to the Suez Crisis by effectively inventing peacekeeping to get the superpowers to stop them from going to war. Today, we're a bit player. Nobody cares about Canada. Nobody listens to Canada. And Canada has exactly zero influence in the region. The Minister of Foreign Affairs excuses this by saying Canada has convening power. To convene, you need to have legitimacy. And I would say Canada has zero legitimacy, especially when it comes to the Middle East. And so that is a serious indictment of Canadian defense and foreign policy because we've lost our ability to leverage and assert our national geostrategic interests.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of things there. I hear what you're saying about Canada and the type of prestige it still carries or not carries at this point. But of course, the fear of these continuing offensives is that they will trigger a greater war. And to that, talk to us about it. Just how great of a war would it trigger? What players are we actually talking about being drawn in?
So let's look at this not from a political, but from a strategic perspective, from Israel's sort of lens, if you want. Israel looked weak after the October 7th attacks. And so what Israel is doing is reestablishing deterrence. It is demonstrating to its adversaries that it is prepared to take whatever measures are required. And look, Hamas presented a threat to Israel, but not an existential threat. Hezbollah and Iran present an existential threat to Israel. And so Israel has decided it has to take the initiative, and Israel has gradually tightened the thumb screws on Hezbollah over recent days, starting with the raid on the weapons factory in Syria, the Hezbollah weapons factory in Syria on September 8th, and then, as we know, escalated with the phones, the walkie-talkies, and then the escalating strikes on the Hezbollah leadership. And it's also in the process, I think, unveiling some of the hypocrisy by Hezbollah, right? That these are organizations that effectively engage in human shields. When you build your military headquarters in a densely populated urban southern Beirut, that is not just a clear intervention of international law, that is flagrantly abusing the civilian population for your military purposes.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Iran, and I did want to ask you about that, because in his speech today, we heard Netanyahu essentially pin the blame on Iran, and Iran, as you say there, backs Hezbollah, backs Hamas, backs Houthis in Yemen. Is the United Nations and the international community failing to rein in Iran, leaving Israel to deal with that failure?
So if you look over the last 20 years in the Middle East, I would say the big winner has ultimately been Iran in the way it's been able to expand its influence in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, with Hamas, and in Yemen. And so Israel is looking at this and going, maybe American international security policy in the Middle East and generally Western sort of strategic security approach to the Middle East isn't working particularly well for Israel. And so you can see from Netanyahu's perspective, he might say this is ultimately Israel has to be able to defend its particular interests here. Now, we can disagree with the tactics and the operations, with the methods that Israel is using, but you can see that ultimately Israel didn't start this particular volley of the fight. It was started by Hamas and at the same time by Hezbollah, that has for a year now been shelling Israel, and that ultimately with its 150,000 rockets aimed at Israel, ultimately Israel decided it could not take that risk.
Well, Christian, as we continue to watch what happens here, always good to have you on and share your insight. Thank you for that.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Michael.